She didn't ask, she didn't warn, she just reached out and grabbed it. Her fingers closed around the gold chain at Margaret Harris's throat and yanked hard, the way you rip a weed out of the ground, and the clasp snapped against the back of a 72-year-old grandmother's neck like a slap. The children screamed, the cabin froze, and Delta flight attendant Stephanie Clark stood in the middle of a full airplane holding a dead woman's necklace in her fist, looking at Margaret Harris like she had just solved a problem. She had not solved a problem. She had just made the worst mistake of her life. But that came later. 12 hours earlier, the morning had started the way most good mornings do. Margaret Harris woke at 5:30 in her house in Atlanta to the sound of her alarm and the weight of a decision she'd already made. The gold necklace sat on her vanity where she'd placed it the night before, catching the first weak light through the blinds. Simple chain, small cross pendant, a chip of diamond no bigger than a freckle. Her mother Dorothy had worn it every single day of her adult life. Church and work and the hospital on the day Margaret was born. Every photograph Margaret had ever seen of her mother featured that necklace resting just below the hollow of her throat. 4 months ago, Margaret had sat in a blue pre-dawn hospital room and unclasped it from her mother's neck for the last time. Her hands had shaken. The metal had still been warm. She picked it up now, fastened it around her own neck, and looked at herself in the mirror. For just a second she saw Dorothy looking back. Same jaw, same eyes, same way of holding your head when you were deciding whether to speak or stay quiet. Margaret had spent 72 years learning which moments required which choice. Today was going to require both. From down the hall came the sound of her grandchildren arguing, which meant they were awake and everything was normal. She walked toward the noise and found Angela and Christopher in the guest room, both already dressed, both glaring at each other with the kind of intensity only siblings can generate over something that will not matter in an hour. Angela, 11 years old and sharp as a new blade, stood with her arms crossed. Christopher, 9, and still soft around the edges in the way boys are before the world teaches them otherwise, was pointing at the window seat on the bed where he'd arranged his backpack and jacket. "Grandma, tell her I called it first." "Grandma, he did not. I sat by the window on the way here. He gets it on the way home. That was the deal." Margaret looked between them. Angela wore a small gold bracelet on her left wrist, the one that had belonged to her mother, Margaret's daughter-in-law, gone now 6 years from a cancer that took her in 4 months. Christopher had a thin chain around his neck with a cross that matched Margaret's, a gift from Dorothy herself on the boy's 5th birthday. This family wore its grief like jewelry, kept the dead close to the skin. Margaret reached over and touched Angela's hand, then looked at Christopher with the kind of calm authority that grandmothers build up over decades. "Baby, your sister is right. A deal is a deal." Christopher opened his mouth, thought better of it, and slid into the middle seat without another word. That was Margaret, patient, measured, the kind of woman who had raised 3 children and buried a husband and cared for her own mother through the last 5 years of her life, and had done all of it with a grace that younger people spent lifetimes trying to learn. She was not a woman who made scenes. She was not a woman who complained. She was the kind of woman who got through things quietly and then went home and prayed and started the next day fresh. But she was also a woman who had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1950s, and there were some things she had learned not to tolerate. By 7:30, they were in the car. By 8:15, they were through security at Hartsfield-Jackson. By 8:40, they were boarding Delta Flight 2287 to JFK, and Margaret was walking down the aisle of the airplane with a grandchild on either side of her, looking for row 14. The flight attendant who stopped her was tall and blonde, maybe 35, with the kind of professionally pleasant expression that flight attendants wear like a uniform. Her name tag read Stephanie Clark. She had been standing near the front of the cabin, doing a visual check of the overhead bins, And when Margaret walked past with the children, something in Stephanie's posture changed. A small shift, the way a dog's ears move when it hears something in the distance. She followed them to row 14. Margaret was helping Christopher with his seatbelt when Stephanie's voice came from directly above her, bright and clean, and carrying just a little too much edge underneath. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remove your jewelry before takeoff." Margaret looked up. She had been bending over Christopher's lap, and for a moment she thought she'd misheard. "I'm sorry?" Stephanie gestured toward Margaret's neck, her wrists, then toward the children. Her hand moved in a loose circle that took in all of them. "The jewelry. You'll need to take it off and store it in your carry-on for the duration of the flight." Margaret straightened slowly. She was 5'4" and had arthritis in both knees that her doctor had been after her about for 3 years. But when she stood up fully and looked at Stephanie Clark, she occupied more space than her height suggested. "What regulation is that?" Stephanie's smile held, but her eyes did something small and quick. Recalculation, maybe. "Or an annoyance. It's a safety concern, ma'am. Metal jewelry can be a hazard in the event of an emergency." Margaret had flown dozens of times in her life. Houston to visit her sister, Atlanta to see these grandchildren, Seattle for her college roommate's 70th birthday. She had flown when they changed the rules about liquids, and when they made you take off your shoes, and when they started charging for checked bags. She had read the safety cards. She had listened to every pre-flight announcement ever made within her hearing. She had never once heard anything about removing jewelry before takeoff. "I've never heard of that rule." "It's policy, ma'am." "Can you show it to me in writing?" Something flickered across Stephanie's face. Just a quick flash, there and gone. Irritation, or maybe something deeper. She blinked once. "I don't carry the policy manual with me, ma'am." "But I am authorized to enforce it." "Authorized by whom?" "By the captain and by Delta Airlines." Margaret kept her voice even, the same tone she'd used 30 years ago when a nurse had tried to tell her she couldn't sit with her husband during his treatment, the same tone she'd used when a bank officer had suggested her late husband's name should stay on the account, instead of transferring it to hers. "I'd like to see that in writing. I've flown dozens of times, and I've never been asked to remove my jewelry. I am not comfortable doing so without understanding the specific regulation you're citing." Stephanie's professional pleasantness was starting to develop a harder edge now, like a coat of paint over something that wanted to crack through. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but—" "No." Margaret's voice stayed quiet. "I don't think you do." The cabin around them had started to notice, not in an obvious way, but in the way people do when something in the air changes. The man across the aisle, mid-50s, business casual, had lowered his magazine and was watching over the top of his reading glasses. 2 rows behind them, a woman had stopped scrolling her phone. In row 11, an older woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain had turned slightly in her seat. Stephanie's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, this necklace belonged to my mother. She passed away 4 months ago." Margaret's hand moved to the pendant, touched it once. "This bracelet belonged to my grandson's mother, who passed 6 years ago. These are family heirlooms. They're not coming off." There was a pause, the kind of pause that has weight in it, that changes the shape of what happens next. "Ma'am," Stephanie said, and now the pleasantness was almost entirely gone, replaced by something that sounded more like a warning. "I need you to comply, or I will have to speak to the captain." Margaret looked at her, really looked at her, studied her the way you study something you want to see all the way through before you respond to it. "Then speak to the captain." Stephanie turned and walked back toward the front of the plane with the kind of stride that means someone is controlling themselves very carefully. Her shoulders were tight. Her steps were precise. Christopher looked up at his grandmother with eyes that were starting to show worry around the edges. "Grandma, are we going to get in trouble?" Margaret put her arm around him, pulled him close enough that he could feel her steadiness. "No, sweetheart, we're not going to get in trouble. We haven't done anything wrong." Then why is she mad? That was the question, wasn't it? Margaret thought about how to answer it. She thought about all the ways she could explain it, the easy explanations and the harder ones, the ones that were age-appropriate and the ones that were simply true. She had answered versions of this question before, for her own children in different decades, in different contexts, with different details, but always essentially the same shape of question underneath. Why is she mad? Why are they looking at us like that? Why do we have to do something everyone else doesn't have to do? "Sometimes," she said carefully, measuring each word, "people make rules for some folks that they don't make for other folks. And when that happens, the right thing to do is to stand still and be calm and tell the truth." Angela, who was 11 and understood more than Christopher did, looked at her grandmother with serious eyes that were older than they should have been. "Is this because we're black?" Margaret held her granddaughter's gaze. She didn't look away, and she didn't soften it. "It might be, baby. I don't know yet, but I know that we have done nothing wrong." 3 rows forward, a white woman in her late 60s with silver hair had heard every word. Her name was Nancy Walker, and she was a retired school teacher from Savannah, Georgia, and she had her own quiet opinion about what she was witnessing. She looked at the woman next to her, younger, maybe 40, business clothes, headphones around her neck, and raised her eyebrows slightly. The younger woman shook her head almost imperceptibly and looked back at her laptop. 4 minutes later, Stephanie Clark returned, and she did not come back alone. She had brought with her the lead flight attendant, a man named Michael Johnson, who had the look of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something and was not yet sure how serious this was going to be. He was maybe 38, Korean American, with dark hair and the kind of controlled energy that comes from years of managing situations in small spaces. "Mrs. Harris." He was consulting what appeared to be a seating manifest. "I'm Michael, the lead cabin crew member for this flight. Stephanie has informed me that you're declining to follow a safety directive." Margaret's voice was so calm it was almost musical. "Stephanie has informed you incorrectly. Stephanie asked me to remove jewelry that has no legitimate connection to any safety policy I have ever heard of. I asked her to show me the policy in writing. She was unable to do that. I declined to comply with an unexplained, unverifiable demand, and I intend to continue declining." Michael blinked. He had been expecting a frightened older woman, or an irate one. He had not been expecting this precise, articulate, utterly composed person who had apparently been paying closer attention than most passengers ever did. "Ma'am, our crew members are empowered to make judgment calls regarding passenger safety." "Under what authority?" Margaret's question came back instantly. "Quoted from what specific FAA regulation? What part of the Code of Federal Regulations covers jewelry removal?" Silence. "Because I am familiar," Margaret continued, her voice still that same calm, steady instrument, "with the fact that the FAA requires rings and metal accessories to be removed for certain medical procedures. I am familiar with the fact that metal detectors at security exist for a different purpose entirely. I am not familiar with any airborne jewelry prohibition. Are you?" Michael Johnson opened his mouth, closed it again. From 2 rows back came a new voice, deep and carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. "Is there a problem back here?" The speaker was a large man, broad-shouldered, maybe 60, with gray hair and the posture of someone who had spent his professional life asking questions that demanded answers. His name was Robert Thompson, though Margaret didn't know that yet. He sounded like someone who was genuinely interested in understanding what the actual issue was. Because from where I'm sitting, I'm watching a flight attendant harass an elderly woman about her necklace, and I'd genuinely like to understand what the actual policy violation is. Stephanie turned to face him, her expression tight. Sir, this is a private conversation. You're having it in the middle of a full airplane. Robert Thompson's voice didn't get louder, but it got harder. That's not private. That's public. What is the regulation you're citing? From 2 rows on the other side, a woman in her late 40s spoke up without looking away from her phone. I heard the whole thing. She asked to see it in writing, and you said you didn't have it. That's correct, came another voice, this one from 3 rows forward, precise and dry as a school attendance report. I heard that too. The second voice belonged to Nancy Walker, the retired civics teacher, who still had not turned around. Stephanie Clark's jaw tightened visibly. A flush was starting to climb up her neck. I need everyone to mind their own business. This is a crew matter. A crew matter that requires an elderly grandmother to take off her dead mother's necklace. Robert Thompson again. Got it. Makes perfect sense. Sir, if you continue to interfere with cabin crew operations, I will have you removed from... Stephanie. Michael Johnson's voice came in, sharp and low, cutting her off. That's enough. Stephanie looked at him. Her face was flushed now, 2 spots of red high on her cheeks. Michael turned to Margaret with the measured expression of a man doing rapid damage control. Mrs. Harris, I apologize for the confusion. We're going to clarify this situation, and in the meantime, please make yourself comfortable. He took Stephanie by the arm and steered her forward with the kind of firm gentleness that left no room for argument. The cabin breathed out, a collective release of tension, subtle but unmistakable. Margaret sat very still for a moment, her hands in her lap. Angela reached over and took her grandmother's hand. Grandma, are you okay? Margaret turned to look at her, 11 years old, her son's child, the spitting image at this age of the girl's late mother, wearing that small gold bracelet that still sometimes made Margaret's throat tighten when the light hit it just right. Yes, baby, I'm okay. But she wasn't done. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her daughter Sharon was back in New York. Sharon, who was 48 and had a law degree and the sharpest mind of any of Margaret's 3 children. Sharon, who called her mother every single morning at 7 without exception. Sharon, who had a way of getting to the center of a problem so fast it made the other lawyers in her firm uncomfortable. Margaret found Sharon's number. She pressed call. It rang twice. Mom, why are you calling? Aren't you on the plane? Is everything... Sharon. Margaret kept her voice quiet and level. I need you to listen to me very carefully. The moment Sharon heard that particular tone, the one that was calm on the surface and vibrating underneath, the one her mother only used when something was genuinely wrong, she stopped moving. Wherever she was, whatever she was doing, she stopped. Mom, talk to me. What happened? A flight attendant just ordered me to remove your grandmother's necklace and the children's jewelry. She cited a safety rule she cannot show me in writing. She came back with the lead attendant. Several passengers have already spoken up. They are now conferring at the front of the plane. A beat of silence. Mom, are you recording this? I am not yet. Start recording right now. Don't stop until the plane lands. What is the airline? Delta. Flight number. Margaret looked at the boarding pass, still in her hand. She gave Sharon the number. Names. Do you have names? Stephanie Clark. The lead is Michael Johnson. There was a sound on Sharon's end. The specific sound of a person sitting down very deliberately and pulling up a laptop. Mom, I want you to stay exactly where you are. Do not move. Do not let them intimidate you. You have done absolutely nothing wrong, and you are about to have the full weight of everything I know how to do standing right behind you. A pause. Then Sharon's voice dropped slightly, shifted from lawyer mode into daughter mode, for just half a second. And, Mom, the necklace stays on. Margaret closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Yes, it does. She hung up. She opened her phone's recording app, the one Angela had helped her install 2 years ago when Margaret had mentioned wanting to record her church choir. She pressed the red button. The screen showed a timer starting to count up. She set the phone on her tray table, face up, screen visible, doing its job quietly. Then Stephanie Clark came back down the aisle. This time, the professional pleasantness was entirely gone. She looked like someone who had talked to someone and come back feeling more powerful than before, whether that power was real or imagined. "Mrs. Harris?" Her voice had taken on a tone that Margaret recognized immediately, the tone of someone who believed they had authority and intended to use it. "I've spoken with the captain. He has authorized me to inform you that your continued refusal to comply with crew directives is a violation of federal aviation regulations, and if you do not remove the jewelry immediately, we will be returning to the gate." Every head in their section turned. The cabin's collective attention swiveled like a radar dish locking onto a signal. "Returning to the gate?" Robert Thompson's voice had gotten very quiet in a way that was more alarming than loudness. "Over a necklace? There are 80 people on this flight, and I'd genuinely like to hear you explain to all of them why we're going back to the gate." Nancy Walker spoke again from 3 rows forward, still not turning around, her voice carrying the particular precision of someone who had taught high school civics for 3 decades. "The captain's authority on board this aircraft is not the same as federal aviation regulations. Those are 2 different things, dear. The captain has discretionary authority over the aircraft. That authority exists within FAA guidelines, not above them." Stephanie stared at the back of Nancy's silver head. "Are you a lawyer?" "No." Nancy turned her head slightly. "I was a high school civics teacher for 31 years, but I paid attention." A sound moved through the cabin, not exactly a laugh, something closer to a collective exhale that had a laugh hiding inside it, waiting. Stephanie Clark's face went red. She turned back to Margaret Harris. And here was where something changed. Here was where whatever restraint or calculation had been guiding her behavior finally gave way to something more reflexive and more revealing. She leaned in close and dropped her voice to something meant to be intimidating. "I don't know who you think you are, but on this plane I am the authority, and you will do what I tell you." The cabin went absolutely silent. Margaret Harris looked at this woman. She looked at her for a long moment. The way you look at something you want to see clearly, want to see all the way through before you respond to it. Margaret was 72 years old. She had been told to sit in the back. She had been told to use a different door. She had been told in 100 different ways, and with 100 different words, that she was less than, that she was other, that the rules were different for her and would always be different for her. She had outlasted every single person who had ever told her so. She was not afraid of Stephanie Clark. "My phone," Margaret said, her voice perfectly, almost preternaturally calm, "has been recording since you began this interaction. Every word you have said, every word these passengers have said, every word I have said." She glanced at the phone on the tray table, its screen still showing the timer counting up. "Including what you just said to me?" Stephanie Clark looked at the phone. "And my daughter," Margaret continued, "who is an attorney, is currently on the phone with Delta Airlines corporate customer service. She has our flight number, your full name, the lead attendant's full name, and a list of witnesses who have already vocally objected to your conduct." She paused. "Would you like to continue telling me who has authority on this plane?" The silence in the cabin was so complete that someone 3 rows back could be heard setting down a cup of water. Then, from somewhere behind Margaret, someone started to clap. A single person. Slow, steady, then a second. Then Robert Thompson 2 rows back joined in, and Nancy Walker, and the woman with the headphones who hadn't said a word until now, and a young couple across the aisle. And before 30 seconds had passed, the entire section of the plane was applauding. Not wildly, not performatively, but with the genuine, deliberate energy of people who had watched something and had an opinion about it. Stephanie Clark turned and walked away from them. Her shoulders were rigid, her steps were fast. Christopher looked at his grandmother with an expression somewhere between awestruck and deeply confused. "Grandma, did you just win?" Margaret picked up her phone and looked at the recording. Still running, she set it back down. "We're not finished yet, baby." But she was smiling. And the necklace, her mother's necklace, that tiny cross with its chip of diamond hanging right where it always hung, caught the cabin light and threw it back, small and gold and perfectly, stubbornly, beautifully intact. The applause died down. The cabin settled. For about 4 minutes, everything was almost quiet. Almost. Margaret kept her hand near her phone. She wasn't looking at the front of the plane, but she was aware of it the way you're aware of a door that isn't fully closed. That low, constant attention in the back of your mind that never quite lets you relax. Angela had her head against the window. Christopher had finally gotten interested in his tablet. And Margaret sat with her hands in her lap and her mother's necklace against her chest, breathing the way Dorothy had taught her to breathe when something was trying to get under her skin, slow, steady, from the bottom. 5 minutes passed. Then Stephanie Clark returned one more time. She did not look at Michael Johnson. She did not bring anyone with her. She walked down the aisle alone, and when she reached row 14, her face was the face of someone who had made a decision and was going to see it through, regardless of what happened next. She stopped. She looked at Margaret. She looked at the children. She looked at Margaret's closed hand, which was resting on the armrest. "The captain has made a decision." Her voice was flat now. No pretense of pleasantness. No attempt at authority. Just words being delivered. "You will be removed from this aircraft." The cabin did not just react. It convulsed. Every person within earshot made some kind of sound or movement. Robert Thompson said something sharp and profane. A man across the aisle, who hadn't said a word until this moment, said flatly, "For a necklace." And behind Margaret, a young woman's voice said clearly, "I'm recording this too." When Margaret glanced back, she saw a phone up, camera facing forward. Christopher grabbed his grandmother's arm with both hands. Angela didn't say anything. She just looked at Stephanie Clark with 11-year-old eyes that were far too old for 11. And the expression on her face was not fear. It was recognition. The specific, heartbreaking recognition of a child who has just understood something about the world that she cannot unknow. Margaret looked at her granddaughter for exactly 1 second. Then she looked back at Stephanie. "On what grounds is the captain removing me?" "Non-compliance with crew directives." "I have complied with every legitimate directive issued on this aircraft." Margaret's voice was still that same instrument of controlled calm. "I fastened my seat belt. I turned off my Bluetooth device. I stowed my carry-on. I have not raised my voice. I have not made threats. I have not touched anyone." She paused. "Can you say the same?" Stephanie's eyes went to the phone on the tray table. "You need to put that away." Passengers are permitted to record interactions with airline staff in the cabin under federal guidelines. Would you like me to cite the specific provision? Mrs. Harris. "Would you like me to cite it?" Robert Thompson from 2 rows back. "I've got it pulled up right here if anyone needs it." Stephanie spun around. "Sir, I am warning you for the last time." "Warning me of what?" Robert's voice was steady, not angry exactly, something harder than anger, something that had been building for the last 15 minutes and had calcified into something immovable. "Warning me that you'll remove me too? Go ahead. Remove me, and the woman in 12B who's recording, and the teacher in 11C who knows her civics. Remove the whole plane. Let's see how that conversation goes for Delta at 6 o'clock tonight." Stephanie turned back to Margaret, and this was the moment. This was the specific, identifiable moment where the situation crossed a line it could not uncross. Because Stephanie Clark reached out her hand. She didn't ask. She didn't warn. She just reached out and grabbed the chain at Margaret Harris's throat with her fingers, and she pulled. The gold caught. The clasp held for one searing second against the back of Margaret's neck, and then it didn't. The chain broke free with a sound so small you could barely hear it over the engine noise, and yet somehow everyone in a 10-row radius heard it. Angela screamed, a real scream, high and sharp and full of genuine terror. Christopher pressed himself against his grandmother's side and grabbed her arm with both hands and made a sound that was not quite a word, just a raw, frightened noise that came from somewhere deep in his chest. And Stephanie Clark stood there with Dorothy Harris's necklace hanging from her closed fist. The cross pendant swung once, twice. The overhead light caught the chip of diamond. Margaret Harris looked at it. She looked at it the way you look at something that you cannot immediately process. The way your mind tries to route the information, and the route keeps coming back wrong because the information doesn't fit inside any category you have for the world. Her mother's necklace, in this woman's hand. The necklace Dorothy had worn on the day Margaret was born. The necklace that had been around Dorothy's neck in the hospital bed on the last morning of her life, and that Margaret had unclasped herself carefully with shaking hands before they took her mother away. For 3 seconds, Margaret Harris did not move. Then she stood up. She was not a large woman. She was 5'4" and had arthritis in both knees. But she stood up the way mountains form, slowly, with an authority that has nothing to do with speed or size, with a weight that comes from somewhere beneath the surface. And when she was fully standing, she looked Stephanie Clark directly in the face from 12 inches away. The entirety of what was in her eyes in that moment made 2 passengers in adjacent rows physically lean away from the interaction. "Give me my mother's necklace." Her voice was so quiet, so absolutely level, that it was more frightening than any volume could have been. Stephanie took a half step back. The movement was instinctive. She caught herself and tried to recover, squaring her shoulders, but the half step had already happened, and everyone had seen it. "This jewelry is—" "Give me my mother's necklace." Margaret said it again, exactly the same. Same volume, same tone, same absolute stillness. Robert Thompson was already out of his seat, not moving toward Stephanie, just standing, fully present, occupying the space behind Margaret with the unmistakable posture of someone who is there. The woman with the phone had come down the aisle and was filming from 6 feet away. Nancy Walker had unbuckled her seatbelt and turned fully around in her seat. Michael Johnson appeared from the front of the cabin at something close to a jog. "Stephanie!" His voice was tight, urgent. "Stephanie, put it. She needs to comply. Stephanie." He was beside her now, and his voice had dropped to something low and intense. "Give her the necklace back right now." A beat. One terrible suspended beat where Stephanie Clark stood in the center of everything she had created, holding a dead woman's necklace, surrounded by witnesses, with a recording running on the tray table and her colleague's hand on her arm, and 70 or 80 people watching. She held it out. Margaret took it. She held it in her palm, the broken chain, the tiny cross, that chip of diamond, and she closed her fingers around it. And for just one moment, one single moment that she did not let anyone see, her face changed. The composure flickered, not fear, not anger, something older and deeper and more private than either of those. Grief, maybe. The grief of a thing you were protecting being touched by something it should never have had to touch. Then it was gone. Her face reset. She looked at Michael Johnson. "I want the captain in this cabin. Now." Michael nodded. He was already pulling out his own phone. "Yes, ma'am. And I want this recorded in the official incident log as of—" She glanced at Christopher's watch on his wrist because her own had been on the same arm as the necklace clasp, and she didn't want to look at her wrist right now. 8:47 a.m. "Yes, ma'am. And I want Stephanie Clark away from me and my grandchildren for the remainder of this flight." Michael looked at Stephanie. Stephanie looked at the floor. "Go to the back of the cabin," Michael said. She walked away. She did not look at anyone. She did not collect her things in front of everyone. She just walked to the back, through the small service area, and disappeared. As soon as she turned away, Christopher wrapped both arms around his grandmother's waist from the side and pressed his face into her arm and didn't say anything. He just held on. Margaret put her hand on the back of his head. She sat down slowly, carefully, the broken necklace still in her closed hand. Angela reached over and opened her grandmother's fingers gently, looked at the broken clasp, and looked up at Margaret's face. "Can it be fixed?" "Yes, baby." "But she broke it." "I know she did." Angela looked toward the back of the plane where Stephanie had gone, with those serious eyes that had seen too much today. "Grandma, what's going to happen to her?" Margaret looked at her granddaughter for a moment, thought about how to answer that, thought about what was true and what was appropriate, and where those two things overlapped. Something that should have happened a long time ago. Her phone was ringing. Sharon. She picked up before the second ring. Mom, what just happened? I've been trying to call for the last 4 minutes." "Sharon." Margaret's voice was steady, perfectly steady. "She took the necklace off me. The chain is broken." The silence on Sharon's end lasted exactly 1.5 seconds. "She what?" "She reached over and took it off my neck, by force. The chain is broken." Another silence, shorter. "Mom, are you physically hurt?" "No." "The kids?" "Frightened, but fine." "Is it on the recording?" Margaret looked at her phone, still running on the tray table. Every second of it. What came next from Sharon was not loud. It was very quiet. In fact, the kind of quiet that is considerably more alarming than loudness. "Mom, I need you to stay on this plane. I need you to speak to the captain when he comes. I need you to get every name, every badge number, every statement offered to you. And I need you to understand that what that woman just did is not an airline policy violation. What she just did is criminal. It's battery." A breath. "I'm no longer calling customer service. I'm calling our attorney." Margaret said nothing for a moment. "Call him," she finally said. She set the phone down. Around her, the cabin had not returned to normal. It would not return to normal. The people in the rows around her had the specific activated energy of witnesses, of people who have seen something and know they have seen something and are in the process of deciding what to do with that knowledge. The young woman who had filmed the interaction had gone back to her seat, but her phone was still in her hand. Robert Thompson was in his seat, but turned sideways, watching the front of the cabin. Nancy Walker had not turned back around. She was looking directly at Margaret, with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and an expression that was entirely quiet and entirely unambiguous. "I want you to know," Nancy said from 3 rows forward across the aisle, "that I saw everything, and I will say exactly what I saw to anyone who asks." "Thank you," Margaret said. "My name is Nancy Walker. I'm from Savannah, Georgia. I am not hard to find." The man across the aisle from Nancy, early 40s, suit jacket, had not said a word all morning. He looked up from his phone. "Same, I've got it all on video. The whole thing, from when she grabbed it." He paused. "My name is Stephen Miller. I'm a journalist. I was on vacation." He looked at his phone. "I'm not anymore." Robert Thompson made a sound, a short, grim sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something darker. Margaret looked at Stephen Miller. She looked at Nancy Walker. She looked at Robert Thompson, who caught her eye and gave a single nod that meant several things at once. "I'm here. I saw it. You're not alone in this." She looked at the young woman with the phone, who nodded too. She looked at the man who had said for a necklace 20 minutes ago, who had gone back to his newspaper but had folded it in half and set it in his lap and was not reading it. She had spent her whole life being told that she was on her own, that the people around her would stay quiet, look away, decide it wasn't their business. She had spent her whole life being surprised by the ones who didn't. She looked down at the necklace in her hand. She was going to get this fixed. She was going to take it to the jeweler in Harlem who had repaired her husband's wedding band 20 years ago. Old Mr. Pearson, who was probably retired by now, but whose son had taken over the shop and had his father's hands. She was going to get it repaired, and she was going to put it back on, and she was going to wear it for the rest of her life. And Stephanie Clark was not going to be any part of that story, except the thing that happened that one time that only made the wearing of it matter more. The cockpit door at the front of the cabin opened, and Captain James Davis stepped out. He was younger than Margaret had expected, maybe 50, with salt and pepper hair, and the precise, economical movements of someone trained to stay calm in situations that are not calm. His name tag read Captain J. Davis. He spoke briefly to Michael Johnson, who spoke even more briefly back, and something passed across the captain's face. A small, involuntary tightening around the eyes that people who are not trained to read faces would miss entirely. Margaret Harris was very trained to read faces. She watched Captain Davis walk down the aisle toward her, and she saw in his face, in those first steps, that he already knew. Someone had already told him, or he had heard it himself, or he had been on the phone with someone who had made very clear what the shape of this situation was. He knew. He stopped at row 14. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the children. He looked at her closed hand. "Mrs. Harris, my name is Captain James Davis. I understand that an incident occurred in the cabin. I want to hear directly from you what happened." Margaret opened her hand. In her palm lay the broken necklace. The chain split where the clasp had been torn. Captain Davis looked at it. His jaw moved once. A small shift, barely perceptible, but Margaret saw it. "Your flight attendant reached over and removed this from around my neck by force after I clearly refused to give it to her voluntarily. The interaction was recorded in full. I have an attorney on the line. I have at least 4 witnesses in this cabin who have identified themselves by name, and I have 2 grandchildren who watched every second of it." She paused. "I would like to know what you intend to do about it." Captain Davis was quiet for 4 seconds. "Mrs. Harris, I want to begin by offering my personal apology. I appreciate that, but I didn't ask for an apology. I asked what you intend to do." Something in his expression shifted. Not irritation, something closer to respect. The kind that gets made in a person without their permission, in response to someone who is exactly who they are, without any performance of it. "We will be returning to the gate." Robert Thompson exhaled from 2 rows back, a sound of vindication mixed with something darker. "Not to remove me." Margaret's voice made it a statement, not a question. "No, ma'am, not to remove you." The cabin understood before he finished saying it. People shifted in their seats, looked at each other, looked toward the back of the plane where Stephanie had gone, and then from the back of the cabin came a sound, a door, a movement, a specific series of footsteps that the entire cabin tracked with their attention, even though no one could see it directly. Michael Johnson walked back up the aisle alone. Stephanie Clark did not come with him. She did not walk past row 14 again. She did not collect her things in front of everyone. She was escorted through the back service area in the quiet procedural way that means the decision has already been made, and the only thing left is the mechanics of it. The cabin didn't erupt. There was no dramatic moment. There was just her absence settling over the rows like a fact that everyone now had to incorporate into their understanding of what had happened. Christopher looked up at his grandmother. "Grandma, is she gone?" Margaret looked toward the front of the plane where Captain Davis was speaking quietly into the intercom handset. Then she looked at her grandson. "Yes, baby, she's gone." Christopher thought about this. Then he nodded once, firmly, the way a 9-year-old nods when he has decided something is resolved, and he can stop worrying about it. But Margaret Harris knew better. She looked at the broken necklace in her hand. She thought about her mother wearing it. She thought about Sharon on a phone right now talking to an attorney. She thought about Stephen Miller, journalist, no longer on vacation. She thought about the recording on her phone, still running, still collecting everything. She closed her fingers around the necklace. This was not over, not even close. The plane hadn't moved yet. The gate was still there, and whatever was waiting on the other side of this flight, the calls, the statements, the things that were going to be said on phones and in offices, and eventually in places considerably more formal than any of that, all of it was still ahead. She was ready. She had been ready for 72 years. The plane returned to the gate at 9:59. Not with any announcement that explained what had happened. Captain Davis came on the intercom and said only that there was a crew adjustment that needed to be handled on the ground before departure, and that he apologized for the delay, and that the airline appreciated everyone's patience. It was the kind of language that said everything by saying nothing, and every single person in that cabin knew exactly what it meant. Margaret sat with the broken necklace still in her hand. She had not put it away, and she had not tried to refasten it. She just held it. Christopher had fallen asleep against her arm with the sudden complete unconsciousness that children are capable of even in the middle of a crisis. Angela sat on her other side, not reading, not looking at her tablet, just staring at the seat back in front of her with the expression of a child processing something she doesn't yet have words for. The jetway connected with a soft, mechanical thud, and then the door at the front of the cabin opened, and 3 people came on board who had not been there before. 2 of them were in Delta uniforms. The third was in a suit. He was a black man, maybe 45, with a badge clipped to his jacket that Margaret couldn't read from row 14, but that clearly carried some kind of authority, because every crew member in the front of the cabin straightened slightly when he walked in. His name, as Margaret would learn in about 4 minutes, was Donald Jackson. He was Delta's Senior Director of Customer Experience for the Southeast region, and he had been in the Delta Sky Club at Hartsfield when Michael Johnson's call came through, which meant that whatever happened next was not going to be filtered through 3 layers of customer service hold music. He walked directly to row 14 without stopping. "Mrs. Harris." He did not say "ma'am." He said her name, which told her that he had been briefed and had actually listened to the briefing. "My name is Donald Jackson. I'm with Delta's regional leadership team. I want to start by saying, before you say anything, I want you to know that this entire interaction is being recorded, and I have an attorney who is currently available by phone if I need her." Donald Jackson nodded once. He didn't flinch, didn't recalibrate, didn't look around at the other passengers. He looked directly at her. "That's completely appropriate. I would expect nothing less." Robert Thompson made a sound from 2 rows back, something between approval and surprise. "I have been briefed on the incident. I have watched video footage recorded by other passengers that was sent to our corporate account approximately 14 minutes ago. I have spoken with Captain Davis, and I want to be direct with you about what I know." He paused. "What happened to you on this aircraft was wrong. It was a violation of your rights as a passenger. It was a violation of Delta's policies, and, based on what I've seen, it may constitute a violation of federal law." The cabin, which had been doing a collective impression of people who were not listening, stopped pretending. The man who had said for a necklace earlier put down his newspaper entirely. "Stephanie Clark has been removed from this flight and has been placed on administrative suspension pending a full investigation." Administrative suspension. Margaret heard the qualifier, not termination. "That determination will be made at the conclusion of the investigation, which will be thorough and which will—" "Mr. Jackson." Margaret's voice was quiet and precise. "That woman reached into my personal space and physically removed a piece of my late mother's jewelry from around my neck, after I clearly refused to give it to her. The chain is broken." She opened her hand and showed him. "I would like you to explain to me what investigation is needed to determine whether that behavior meets the standard for termination." The cabin was so quiet that the sound of the jetway adjusting outside was audible. Donald Jackson looked at the broken necklace in her palm. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up. "You're right. You are completely right." Angela turned her head slowly and looked at the Delta executive with the careful attention of someone recalibrating their understanding of how adults operate. "I cannot make a termination announcement to you at this moment because that is a human resources process with specific legal requirements. What I can tell you is that I am personally going to ensure that this investigation does not take weeks or months. You will hear from us within 48 hours. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a business card on the tray table. "That is my direct line, not a call center, my phone. You or your attorney can reach me on that number at any time." Margaret looked at the card. She didn't pick it up yet. "And what about this flight?" "This flight will depart as soon as we complete a crew adjustment. You will be upgraded to first class, you and both of your grandchildren, for the remainder of the journey. All travel expenses for today will be refunded in full, and Delta will cover the repair of the necklace through whatever jeweler you choose." "The necklace is not the point. No, ma'am, it is not. But it is the least we can do right now, and I want to do it." He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Harris, I am not here to manage this situation. I'm here because what happened here today is not who we are or who we are supposed to be, and I am genuinely sorry." Margaret studied him. She was very good at reading sincerity. She had been doing it for 7 decades in churches and courtrooms and hospital corridors and corporate offices. She read him for a moment, and then she nodded once. "I'll take the seat upgrade for my grandchildren, not for me. I'll stay right here." Donald Jackson blinked. "Ma'am, I said what I said." Robert Thompson laughed. It was a real laugh, short, warm, the involuntary kind. Angela looked at her grandmother, and something moved across her face, something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family as a smile, and would probably grow into one later. Donald Jackson stood for another moment, then nodded. "I'll arrange for the children to be moved, and for anything you need for the remainder of the flight to be brought to you here." He paused. "Is there anything else you need from me right now?" Margaret picked up his business card. "Not right now, but there will be." He understood what that meant. He nodded again and walked back toward the front of the cabin, pausing briefly to speak to Captain Davis. And then the door closed, and the jetway disconnected, and the engines, which had gone quiet, slowly began their low rumble back to life. Christopher woke at the sound of the engines and looked around blurrily. "Are we leaving?" "Yes, baby, we're leaving." "Is the mean lady still here?" "No." He blinked, thought about this, closed his eyes again. It was 9:54. The plane began to taxi at 10:03. By 10:22, they were airborne, and Margaret sat in row 14 with her phone still recording and Donald Jackson's business card in her purse and the broken necklace wrapped carefully in a tissue in her pocket. And she thought about what came next. Her phone buzzed at 10:38. Not a call, a text from Sharon, "Mom. Delta just issued a public statement. Stephanie Clark has been terminated, effective immediately. CEO, personal apology coming. Are you still okay?" Margaret read it twice. She typed back, "Still okay, still recording." She put the phone down and looked out the window at the clouds below. 30,000 feet up, the world looked smooth and ordered and simple. No texture, no conflict, just shapes and light. Down there, things were considerably more complicated. Her phone rang at 10:41. Sharon again. Mom, I need to tell you something. Margaret pressed the phone to her ear. Tell me. Stephen Miller, the journalist on the plane. He filed a story 20 minutes ago. It's already running on 3 news sites. The video has been seen 400,000 times. Margaret sat very still. It's not just the video of Stephanie grabbing the necklace. He had audio from before that, the whole conversation. He had it all, Mom, from the first time she came to the row. Sharon's voice was controlled, but something was vibrating inside it. People are calling for Delta to fire her. Not just online, actual public figures. A senator from Georgia just issued a statement. The NAACP has already released a response. A beat. Mom, your name is everywhere right now. Margaret looked at the seat back in front of her. She thought about Dorothy Harris, about a woman who had worn the same gold necklace every day for 50 years, not because anyone was watching, but because she knew who she was and she did not need permission to be it. What does our attorney say? He says we have a strong civil rights claim. Intentional infliction of emotional distress, possibly battery. Physical contact without consent in a state of aggression. He wants to move quickly. Sharon's voice steadied. But Mom, it's what I found out about Stephanie Clark that I really need to tell you. Margaret waited. She's been reported before. This is not the first time. The air in the cabin did not change. The engines kept making the same sound, but something shifted in Margaret's chest. That cold, clarifying shift that happens when a thing you suspected but didn't want to be certain of becomes certain. How many times? 7 formal complaints in the last 5 years. 4 of them were from Black or Latino passengers. All 7 were resolved internally. Sharon's voice tightened on those 2 words, the way you tighten a wire. Resolved internally, meaning buried, meaning someone saw those complaints and cleared her to keep working. Margaret closed her eyes, which means this is not just about Stephanie Clark anymore. This is about what Delta knew, and when they knew it, and what they chose to do with that knowledge. The plane was at 37,000 feet. Below it, the eastern seaboard was going about its morning, and in row 14, a retired grandmother held a broken necklace and understood with perfect clarity what she was going to do next. Sharon? Yeah, Mom. How is Uncle George? A short, involuntary laugh. The exact same laugh Sharon had inherited from Dorothy. He's furious, and he's making calls, and he will not listen to a word I say. Good. Let him. Mom, Sharon, listen to me. She paused, made sure she had her daughter's full attention. We are not just going to win this for us. Do you understand what I'm saying? A long beat. Then Sharon quietly, I understand exactly what you're saying. Those other families, the ones who filed complaints and were told it was resolved, I want to find them. Mom, I want to find them, because if they were willing to file a complaint once and got nowhere, they might be willing to speak now that there's a camera and an attorney and a retired circuit court judge and apparently a senator from Georgia involved. Sharon was quiet for a moment. You are terrifying. And her voice was full of a love so complete it barely needed the word attached to it. I learned from your grandmother. Margaret put the phone down. She picked up Donald Jackson's card and Robert Thompson's handwritten statement that he had given her before deplaning, and she laid them side by side on the tray table, and she looked at them. Then she picked up the broken necklace again. She thought about the 7 complaints, 7 families, 7 sets of people who had tried to say something and had been shown that what they said didn't matter. She thought about Stephanie Clark being cleared back to full duty 7 times to go stand in another aisle on another flight and decide which passengers needed to be reminded of who had authority. The anger that moved through her was not hot. It had moved past hot some time ago and settled into something colder and cleaner and more durable than heat. The kind of anger that doesn't yell, the kind that writes things down, the kind that makes calls and keeps records and does not forget. At 11:15, with 40 minutes still left in the flight, Michael Johnson came back down the aisle. He stopped at row 14 and crouched down slightly, speaking in a low voice. "Mrs. Harris, I want to say, personally, that I'm sorry for the way this went, for not moving faster when I should have." Margaret looked at him. He was in his late 30s, with the look of someone who had been running things through his head for the last hour and was not happy with what he found. "Why didn't you?" Not with anger, with genuine inquiry. He exhaled. "Because she's been here longer than me, and because I told myself it was a policy issue, and she knew the policies better than I did." A pause. "I knew that wasn't true. I think I knew that when she came back the second time, I should have stopped it then." Margaret let that sit for a moment. "Will you say that? In writing, if you're asked to?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes, I will." She nodded once. He stood and walked away, and Margaret turned and looked out across Angela's empty seat to the window. Clouds below, the ordinary, spectacular indifference of the sky at altitude. She thought about the night her mother died. She thought about sitting in that hospital room in the blue pre-dawn silence and taking that necklace off Dorothy's neck for the last time. The way the clasp had opened so easily under her fingers. The way the chain had coiled into her palm like something alive that was becoming something still. She thought about putting it on the next morning and the morning after that and every morning since. She thought about Stephanie Clark's hand on it, the chain snapping. She thought about 3 other families, at minimum, who had tried to say something and been told their something didn't count. She thought about Angela in first class now, probably reading her book, but carrying something in her that wasn't in there this morning. The knowledge of what her grandmother did and didn't do and why. The specific transmitted knowledge that passes between women across generations, not through conversation, but through witnessing. She thought about Christopher asleep against her arm for 40 minutes earlier, and the fact that when he woke up, he had asked immediately whether the mean lady was still there, and when told she wasn't, he had closed his eyes again with the matter-of-fact calm of someone who had decided that the adults had handled it, and he could rest. She hoped he would always have that particular ability to rest when the adults handled it. She hoped the world would not spend his life teaching him that he couldn't afford it. At 11:41, the pilot announced their initial descent into JFK. Margaret Harris picked up her phone and sent one text to Sharon. 5 words, "Find the other families." The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Already on it. The plane began to descend. New York came up slow beneath them, gray and enormous and indifferent and full of everything. And Margaret Harris sat in row 14 with a broken necklace in one hand and a retired judge's business card in the other. And she was not finished. Not even close. They landed at 12:03. The wheels hit the runway with that familiar shudder, and the cabin shifted forward, and Christopher woke up immediately the way he always did, fully alert like someone had flipped a switch, and looked at his grandmother with clear eyes. "Are we home?" "Almost, baby, almost." The plane taxied for 7 minutes, and Margaret used every one of them. She had 3 voicemails she hadn't listened to yet, 11 text messages, and 2 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize that had left no messages at all. Sharon had texted twice more since the descent began. The first said the attorney had already made contact with Delta's legal department. The second said simply, "Mom, turn on the news when you land." Margaret looked at that text for a long moment. Then the plane stopped, and the seatbelt sign went off, and the cabin erupted into the usual choreography of people standing too fast and opening overhead bins and checking their phones all at once. Robert Thompson stood up behind her and touched her shoulder lightly as people began to move. "Mrs. Harris, I want to give you something before we get off." She turned. He was holding a folded piece of paper, his own notepad paper, she realized, from a small leather notepad she hadn't noticed him carrying. He had written on it in a precise, clear hand. She took it and unfolded it. It was a statement. 4 paragraphs. What he had witnessed, in order, with times noted, signed at the bottom. The Honorable Robert A. Thompson, Circuit Court Judge, Fulton County, Georgia, retired. She read it once, looked up at him. I've already sent a copy to the FAA's Passenger Rights Division. From my phone during the flight. It went out at 9:58 this morning. Margaret held the paper. My daughter is an attorney. I know, I heard. A brief smile. She sounds like she knows what she's doing. She does. She gets it from her grandmother. She folded the statement and put it in her purse with Donald Jackson's card and the broken necklace and all the other pieces of this morning that were accumulating into something she hadn't fully named yet, but could feel the shape of. Nancy Walker was waiting in the aisle when Margaret stepped out of row 14. She handed Margaret a folded piece of paper too. Her name, her phone number, her email, and the name of the school she had taught at for 31 years, as if she knew that institutional credibility was going to matter. Savannah, Georgia, like I told you, I remember. My late husband was a civil rights attorney. He worked cases in the 80s. I know what this kind of thing costs the people who pursue it. And I want you to know that what I saw today is worth pursuing. Margaret looked at this woman. Silver hair, reading glasses, small gold earrings, probably 70, maybe older. She had sat in that seat this morning and heard everything and said exactly the right things at exactly the right moments, and had asked for nothing in return. Thank you. And she meant it in a way the word couldn't fully carry. Stephen Miller was already in the jetway, on his phone, when they came through. He looked up when he saw Margaret and lowered the phone. Mrs. Harris, I owe you a disclosure. I filed a story while we were in the air. It's already running. I should have asked first. Margaret looked at him. Yes, you should have. He absorbed that. I'm sorry, the story needed to be out before anyone could shape the narrative around it. I understand the logic. I'm saying you should have asked. He nodded. Fair. A pause. My editor wants an interview, a real one, on record. Not a quote, a full story. Your side, your words. Talk to my daughter. And Margaret kept walking. She came through the gate into the terminal at 12:19, and Sharon was there, not on the phone, not on her laptop, just there, standing 20 feet from the gate with both arms already open. And when Margaret saw her, she felt something that had been held very tightly inside her chest since 8:47 that morning begin very slowly to release. Sharon Robinson was 48 years old, tall and sharp-featured, dressed in the kind of put-together way that meant she had left a meeting or a call to be here. But she had left it without hesitation. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's jaw, and she was crying before Margaret had taken 3 steps toward her, which was notable because Sharon Robinson did not cry easily and did not do it in public under any circumstances that could be avoided. They held each other without speaking for a moment. Christopher immediately threw himself at his aunt's legs. Auntie Sharon, a lady broke Grandma's necklace. Sharon held her mother with one arm and pulled Christopher in with the other. I know, baby, I know. Angela came through behind them, carrying her own bag and Christopher's, and Sharon reached out and got her too, and for a moment, all 4 of them were tangled together in the middle of the JFK arrival hall, while people flowed around them with their rolling bags and their phone screens and their Tuesday urgencies, paying no particular attention to this knot of family that had just come through something. Then Sharon pulled back and looked at her mother's face. Are you hurt? The attorney voice was gone. This was just Sharon. No. The necklace. Margaret opened her purse and showed her the broken chain wrapped in tissue. Sharon's jaw tightened. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she looked at her mother, and something passed between them that was too old and too deep to be put in any language currently in use. The kind of communication that happens between a woman and her daughter when both of them have loved the same person their whole lives, and that person is gone now, and the only things left of her are exactly the things that need protecting. Donald Jackson called me at 12:07. Delta has placed Stephanie Clark on unpaid suspension. Not paid, unpaid. Their legal department has already reached out to our attorney. I think they know what they're sitting on. They should, because I do. Sharon's expression shifted. The other families. I found one. Margaret went very still. Her name is Linda Martinez. She flew Delta out of Charlotte in 2022. She filed a formal complaint about Stephanie Clark. The exact same pattern. Linda is a nurse. She was flying home from a medical conference. Stephanie told her the stethoscope around her neck was a safety hazard and demanded she remove it. Sharon paused. Delta's response was a 3-line form letter and a $50 flight credit. Margaret stopped walking, just for a moment, just to let that sit. $50. $50. Has anyone spoken to her? Our attorney made contact 45 minutes ago. She's been watching the news. She already said yes. They were moving through the terminal toward the exit now. Sharon's hand on her mother's arm, the children just ahead. Margaret's phone rang again. Another number she didn't know. Different area code. She answered it this time. Mrs. Harris, this is Patricia Moore. I'm the director of the Eastern Region Legislative Affairs Office for the NAACP. We've been in contact with your daughter this morning, and I want you to know that our national legal team is available to you immediately at no cost if you choose to pursue this. Margaret had been a member of the NAACP for 51 years. She had paid her dues every year since 1974, in good times and tight times both, because her mother had told her that you pay your dues not for what it gives you, but for what it means you're part of. She had never once expected to receive this particular call. I appreciate that deeply. Please speak with my daughter. She handed the phone to Sharon, who took it with one hand while pulling up something on her own phone with the other, moving with the efficient multi-tracked intensity of a woman who had shifted from personal to professional without losing either. They reached the exit at 12:34, and that is when Margaret saw the cameras. Not the overwhelming bank of equipment you see at press conferences, just 3 news crews, local affiliates, set up with the specific preparedness of people who had been tipped off that this was the right exit at the right time. Stephen Miller, Margaret realized, or possibly George, who was standing 30 feet away, looking exactly as described, which was to say furious and making calls, and who looked up when he saw Margaret and said her name across the distance in a voice that carried considerably more grief than fury when he actually saw her face. Margaret looked at the cameras. She thought about what Sharon had said on the plane. Your name is everywhere. She thought about not wanting that, about the deep, genuine preference of a private woman who had spent 72 years solving her problems without an audience. She thought about Linda Martinez and her $50 flight credit. She thought about the 7 families, 7 complaints, 7 sets of people who had tried to say something. She walked directly toward the cameras. Sharon caught up beside her in 2 steps. Mom, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She stopped in front of the first reporter, a young woman with a microphone who looked about 25 and who had the nervous, urgent energy of someone covering her first genuinely significant story. Mrs. Harris, can you tell us what happened on the plane this morning? Margaret looked at the camera. She thought about how to begin. She thought about Dorothy Harris, who had once told her that the most dangerous thing a black woman could do in America was be ordinary in public. Not angry, not threatening, just ordinary and present and unbowed, because ordinariness in a black woman was somehow still, in this country, a provocation to certain kinds of people. I was sitting with my grandchildren, wearing my late mother's necklace. She passed 4 months ago. A flight attendant demanded I remove it. I declined. She took it off me by force. She held up the broken chain so the camera could see it. The reporter stared at the chain for a moment. What would you like to see happen as a result of today? I would like Stephanie Clark to be terminated. I would like Delta Airlines to conduct a genuine, transparent investigation into how many other passengers she treated this way and how many complaints were filed and buried. I would like Linda Martinez, a nurse from Charlotte, who filed a complaint against this same flight attendant in 2022 and received a $50 voucher to receive the same attention her complaint deserved 2 years ago. She paused. And I would like my grandchildren who watched all of this morning to understand that you do not have to accept being treated this way, that your history, your family, your mother's jewelry, none of it is subject to someone else's authority to remove. She was aware of Angela standing just behind her left shoulder. She could feel her granddaughter listening to every word. The second camera had come in closer. The reporter from the second outlet was already talking in a low voice to Sharon, and Margaret thought about what came next, about the calls that would be made, and the meetings that would happen, and the things that would be set in motion that could not be unset. She thought about 7 families, about the ones they had found and the ones they hadn't yet. She thought about making sure that what happened to her this morning was not just about her. There are more families, other passengers who filed complaints against this flight attendant that we have not yet identified. If you are that person and you are watching this, please reach out to my daughter. We are standing together on this. You are not alone. She was done talking to the cameras. She turned away before anyone could ask another question, and Sharon stepped in behind her to handle whatever came next. And George was immediately on his phone again. And Margaret walked through the glass doors and into the New York air and stopped. Angela appeared beside her. She had both bags again, and she stood next to her grandmother and looked out at the street and was quiet for a long moment. "Grandma, who is Linda Martinez?" "A woman who tried to do what's right and got ignored until today." Angela processed this. "Is that what you meant on the plane about not being finished just for us?" Margaret looked at her granddaughter, 11 years old, the kind of 11 that has seen things and heard things and is assembling them into an understanding of the world that is going to shape who she becomes. That's exactly what I meant. It was 12:49. Sharon came through the doors at 12:53, phone in hand, and the expression on her face stopped Margaret cold. Not good news, not bad news exactly. Something that was both layered on top of each other in the specific way that things are when a situation has developed faster and larger than even your best preparation accounted for. "Mom, I just got off the phone with Donald Jackson." Margaret waited. "They found the other families. Delta found them before we did." Margaret held completely still. "How many?" 6 more complaints, total of 7, like we thought. 3 families we can confirm so far. Linda Martinez in Charlotte, a family from Memphis, 2023, mother and 2 daughters. Stephanie told the mother her daughter's earrings were a distraction to other passengers. A beat. The mother is a retired school teacher. Her name is Betty Anderson. She filed a complaint, and Delta sent her a form letter. Sharon looked at her mother. She saw the news this morning. She called Delta directly at 9:15. She had kept the form letter. She had kept every email. She has names and dates and seat numbers. The air moved through Margaret in a way she felt physically. Not quite a shiver, not quite a breath. The specific interior movement of a thing clicking into place. 7 families, all women, all told to remove something from their bodies, all told afterward that it had been handled, and one of them, at least, who had kept every piece of paper. Betty Anderson kept her records. For 2 years, she told the Delta representative this morning that she kept them because she knew one day it would matter. She just didn't know when. George, who had been listening, stopped pacing. He looked at his sister. His face did something complicated, and then he sat down on a bench and pressed both hands over his mouth for a moment. "Mama would have—" he started and didn't finish. "I know. She would have gone down there herself personally. I know, George." He exhaled, nodded, stood back up, picked up his phone again. "What do you need me to do?" Margaret looked at him. "Right now, I need you to take these children somewhere and get them lunch. They've been on their feet since 6 this morning, and they're hungry, and they've seen enough today." George looked at Christopher, who was leaning against the wall with the expression of someone who would very much like a cheeseburger. "I can do that." He put his hand on the back of Margaret's head. Not a pat. Something more deliberate than that. The specific touch of a brother making sure his sister is still there. "You good?" "Getting there." He nodded, called the kids. They left. Sharon waited until they were gone, then turned to her mother. 2 hours. We have a call at 2:15 with our attorney, the NAAC legal team, and a representative from Betty Anderson's side, because Betty already has an attorney, too." Margaret looked at her. "She got one in 2023, right after Delta sent her the form letter. She just never had enough to move forward with until now." And there it was. The moment that arrives in every situation like this one. When what looked like one woman's personal fight on one Tuesday morning reveals itself to be something that was already years in the making, already building, already waiting for the right moment to have enough weight behind it to move. Margaret thought about sitting on that plane this morning, helping Christopher with his seatbelt, about Angela arguing for the window seat, about the necklace against her chest and the routine of putting it on that morning and the specific ordinary way the day had started. She had not been looking for this. She had not wanted this. She had simply been on her way home. She reached into her purse and found the broken necklace. She laid it across her palm one more time and looked at it. The chain was clean and gold. The damage was precise. Just the clasp broken where it had been pulled. Everything else intact. The cross still there. The diamond chip still catching light. She closed her fingers around it. "Let's go." Sharon flagged a car. They got in. The city moved past the windows. The enormous, indifferent, complicated city that had been Margaret's home for 46 years when she lived here with her husband, and then for 20 years after he was gone, and then for the last 6 years, split between here and Atlanta, where her son had moved with the grandchildren. New York didn't care what had happened on Delta Flight 2287. New York had its own problems. Margaret held the necklace in her closed hand the whole way, the same way she had held it since the moment it was taken from her and the moment she took it back. At 2:07, they were in Sharon's apartment in Manhattan. The table was already set up. Laptop open, notepad, 2 pens, a glass of water for her mother that Sharon sat down without asking. Margaret sat, drank, looked at the notepad. "Tell me about Kenneth Scott." Sharon pulled up a chair. 22 years in civil rights litigation. He's won 4 cases against major carriers, 2 of them airline-related discrimination. He's been on the phone with the NAACP legal team since 10 this morning. A beat. He already has a copy of Robert Thompson's statement. The judge emailed it directly to his office at 9:58. Kenneth called Robert personally at 11:15. They talked for 40 minutes. Robert didn't tell me that. Robert strikes me as someone who handles things and then doesn't announce that he handled them. Margaret thought about a retired circuit court judge from Atlanta sitting in his seat 2 rows back, filling out his notepad in careful handwriting while the engines hummed, sending it to the FAA and a civil rights attorney before the wheels touched the ground, asking for nothing, expecting no recognition. She made a mental note to call him. The conference line opened at 2:15 exactly. Kenneth Scott's voice was calm and deliberate, the kind that takes up space in a room without needing to be loud. He had a way of speaking that suggested he had seen enough cases like this one to know which details mattered and which ones didn't. "Mrs. Harris, I want to begin by saying I've listened to the full recording twice. I've watched both videos, yours and Stephen Miller's. I've read Judge Thompson's statement. I've reviewed the formal incident report filed by Captain Davis, which Delta's legal department transmitted to us at 12:03 this afternoon. A brief pause. This is one of the most thoroughly documented passenger civil rights violations I have seen in over 2 decades of practice. Margaret said nothing. Let him continue. What Stephanie Clark did constitutes, at minimum, battery under New York state law. Physical contact that was harmful and offensive and made without consent. It also establishes a strong foundation for a federal civil rights claim under Section 1981, which covers racial discrimination in the making and enforcement of contracts, including airline passenger contracts. Another pause. It means that Delta's pattern of receiving and dismissing complaints about this specific employee creates what we call institutional liability. They cannot claim they didn't know. They knew. They chose inaction 7 times. Patricia Moore, the NAACP representative on the line, spoke next. Mrs. Harris, I want to add that we have already identified media contacts at the Associated Press, the Washington Post, and 3 network affiliates who are following this story as of this morning. This is no longer a local incident. This is national. Margaret was quiet for a moment. How is Linda Martinez? A slight pause. Kenneth's voice. She's been in contact with our office since 11:40. She's steady. She's angry, appropriately so, and she wants to move forward. And Betty Anderson? A new voice came on the line. A woman. Memphis number. A voice like someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Ruth Ann's attorney here. Sylvia Grant. Betty is ready. She has been ready since Delta sent her that letter in 2023. There was a quality to the way Sylvia said it. Not triumphant. Something quieter. Something that had weight. She said this morning that she didn't keep those papers because she was certain something would happen. She kept them because she refused to pretend it hadn't. Margaret closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. She thought about 3 women, herself, 72, sitting in row 14 with her grandchildren. Linda Martinez, a nurse flying home from a conference, told her stethoscope chain was a hazard. Betty Anderson, a retired schoolteacher, watching her daughters, told their earrings were a distraction. 3 different flights, 3 different years, 3 different reasons that all had the same shape underneath. What do we do next? Kenneth's voice came back, simple and direct. We file a joint civil complaint on behalf of all 3 of you. We file it as a pattern of discriminatory conduct, not 3 separate incidents. He paused. Delta's internal records, which their legal team was required to produce this morning under our preservation letter, show that Stephanie Clark received formal complaints from a total of 7 passengers over 5 years. 7, Mrs. Harris, not 3. 4 of those complaints were from Black or Latino passengers. 3 were closed without investigation. The line was silent. Sharon wrote something on the notepad and turned it toward her mother. It said, 7. Margaret looked at the number. She had thought 3. 3 families had been a weight she felt in her chest. 7 was a different kind of weight entirely. 7 was not a pattern that could be explained away. 7 was a policy. 7 was a decision made repeatedly by people who had the power to stop it and chose not to. When can we file? By end of business Friday. But I want to be honest with you about what that means. It will be public. It will be loud. Delta's legal team is already working to manage the narrative. Filing this week keeps the pressure exactly where it needs to be. But it also means your name and Linda's name and Betty's name are going to be in every major newspaper in the country within 24 hours of filing. They're already there, Kenneth agreed quietly. Yes, they are. Then Friday. Sharon nodded once. The call ended at 2:51. Sharon closed the laptop. She looked at her mother. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the apartment was quiet, with the particular quiet of after. The specific silence that falls when a long, impossible, exhausting morning has finally shifted into something that has direction and weight and forward motion. You okay? 7 families, 7 complaints. We've confirmed 3. The other 4, find them if they're willing. No pressure on anyone who's not ready, but give them the option. She paused. Nobody should have to do this alone. Sharon looked at her mother for a long moment. You know this is going to take a while, months, maybe longer. It's going to be uncomfortable. They're going to look into everything about you, your finances, your history, your... Sharon. Margaret looked at her daughter. I am 72 years old. I grew up in Birmingham. I have been audited, followed, questioned, and dismissed more times than I can count. A team of corporate attorneys going through my credit history is not going to be the hardest thing I have faced. A beat. Not even close. Sharon's eyes went bright for a moment. She pressed them steady, nodded. Okay, Mom. At 4:17, Margaret received a call she had not been expecting. An Atlanta number, unfamiliar. She answered anyway. Mrs. Harris, my name is Carol Lewis. I was on your flight this morning. The voice was a woman's, older, tired, careful. The voice of someone who had been rehearsing what she was going to say and wasn't entirely sure she was ready to say it. Margaret placed her immediately. Row 22, the woman who had sat silent while everything unfolded. I was in row 22. I didn't say anything. I want you to know that I've been sitting with that all day. Margaret said nothing. Let her continue. I didn't say anything when it was happening, and I don't feel right about that. The specific texture of what Margaret felt in that moment was complicated. It was not anger, and it was not forgiveness, and it was not absolution, and it was not dismissal. It was something that required all of those things to be present at once without any of them taking over. What made you call? My daughter sent me the video. She saw it online before I even landed. She called me screaming. A pause, and Carol's voice wobbled slightly. And I had to tell her I was on that plane, that I saw it happen, and she asked me what I did. A beat. I didn't have an answer for her. Margaret thought about this. She thought about all the rows of passengers that morning, the ones who spoke up, the ones who filmed, the ones who stayed silent. She thought about how easy it was to be angry at the silence and how complicated the silence actually was, the calculations people make in those moments, the fear, the uncertainty, the telling yourself it will resolve on its own, or that it's not your place, or that you didn't see enough to be sure of what you saw. Do you have children? Carol sounded surprised by the question. 3, and 4 grandchildren. Then let me ask you something. If it had been you in row 14 this morning, if it had been your grandchildren, would you have wanted someone in row 22 to say something? A long silence. Carol quietly, yes, I would have. Then you know what you're going to do differently next time. Another silence. Not the heavy kind, something lighter and harder to name. Thank you. Don't thank me, just do it next time. Margaret hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she put it down and picked up her glass of water and looked at nothing in particular and thought about how many Carol Lewises there had been over the years, how many people in row 22 watching, calculating, staying quiet. How many of them had gone home afterward and felt this exact same thing and never made a call? How many next times had come and gone without the lesson carrying forward? She hoped this one would be different. She suspected it would be for Carol Lewis specifically. Some lessons land, some don't. You can't control which kind you're giving while you're giving it. At 7:02 that evening, Stephen Miller sent Sharon a text with a link and 3 words. You need this. Sharon opened it. Read it. Her face went through 3 separate expressions in about 4 seconds. Shock, then understanding, then a slow, cold fury that settled into something very still. She handed the phone to her mother. It was an article Stephen had been working on all day. He had been reporting, pulling threads, making calls to former colleagues of Stephanie Clark, running down employment records. He had found something. Stephanie Clark had worked for Southwest Airlines from 2016 to 2018. She had received a written reprimand in May of 2018 for what the document called inappropriate interactions with passengers. The complaint had come from a black family traveling to a funeral in Houston. They had objected to the way Stephanie had spoken to them about their carry-on bags and the clothing their teenage daughter was wearing. Southwest had not fired her, but when Stephanie applied to Delta 6 months later, Southwest had not recommended her either. There was a note in her file. Informal, not part of the official record, just a line from the HR manager who processed her exit interview. Concerns about passenger interactions remain unresolved. Delta had hired her anyway in November of 2018. Either they had not checked thoroughly, or they had checked and decided it didn't matter. Margaret read it once. Put the phone down. She was going to do this. It wasn't random. The plane wasn't random. The jewelry wasn't random. Sharon's voice was very controlled. She looked at you, and she saw what she had always decided she saw, and she acted on it. Margaret sat back. She thought about Stephanie Clark standing in that aisle. She thought about the specific moment when Stephanie's eyes had moved over Margaret and the children and the jewelry, and something had shifted behind them. She thought about Christopher with his seatbelt. She thought about Angela arguing for the window seat. She thought about the specific innocence of that argument. Two children negotiating a fair arrangement on their way home with their grandmother, wearing their family's gold. She looked at my grandchildren, and she decided. Yes, the room was very quiet. Send it to Kenneth. Already done, while you were reading. Thursday evening, 2 days after the incident, Margaret's phone buzzed with a news alert. Delta Airlines schedules press conference. CEO Richard White to address Flight 2287 incident, Thursday, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Sharon showed her mother the screen at 5:45. They turned on the television at 5:58. Richard White appeared on the screen at 6:03. He was not at a podium. He was sitting at a desk. No tie, looking directly into the camera, and he was not using the careful corporate language of managed crisis communication. He looked like a man who had watched the recording himself and had felt it. What happened to Mrs. Margaret Harris and her grandchildren on Flight 2287 Tuesday morning is not a policy failure. It is not a training failure. It is a moral failure. He paused. Let that sit. And it happened on our watch, to a passenger who was traveling with her family, wearing her late mother's necklace, doing nothing wrong. Another pause. Stephanie Clark has been terminated. That termination is permanent and is not pending any review. Margaret leaned forward slightly. I also want to say directly, Delta failed Mrs. Harris and her family, not just Tuesday, but in 2021 and 2023, when passengers brought complaints to us that we should have taken more seriously and did not. Sharon inhaled sharply. He had just admitted prior knowledge on camera in public. I am ordering an immediate and complete review of every passenger complaint filed against cabin crew in the last 5 years. Every complaint. Every one. He looked into the camera one more time. Mrs. Harris, if you're watching this, I am sorry, and I mean that as a human being, not as a CEO. The video ended. Sharon and Margaret sat with it for a moment. He did not have to say 2021 and 2023. His legal team almost certainly told him not to. But he did. He did. Sharon looked at her mother. Kenneth says it actually strengthens our position because it's a public admission of prior knowledge. But, she paused, I don't think he said it for legal strategy. I think he said it because it was true, and he knew it was true, and he decided Truth mattered more than strategy today. Margaret looked at the frozen image of Richard White on the laptop screen. Good, then we'll hold him to it. Friday at 3 in the afternoon, Margaret stood on the steps of the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Sharon beside her. Angela, who had asked to come, stood on her other side. Kenneth Scott was addressing a small crowd of reporters. Today, we filed a federal civil rights complaint on behalf of 3 women, Mrs. Margaret Harris, Dr. Linda Martinez, and Ms. Betty Anderson. This complaint alleges a pattern of discriminatory conduct by a Delta Airlines flight attendant over a period of 5 years, and alleges that Delta Airlines failed to take appropriate action despite receiving 7 formal complaints. He paused. This is not about one bad employee. This is about a system that received 7 complaints and did nothing. We are seeking accountability, policy change, and justice for every passenger who was told their complaint didn't matter. Inside the courthouse, 15 minutes earlier, Margaret had met Linda Martinez and Betty Anderson for the first time. Linda was 45, black, a physician, composed, but with something vibrating just beneath the surface. She had driven up from Charlotte that morning. When she saw Margaret, she walked straight to her and took both of her hands. Mrs. Harris, I watched you on the news Tuesday. I was in my car, I pulled over, and I cried. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. Not because I was sad, because I wasn't alone anymore. Margaret held her hands. For 3 years I thought it was just me, that maybe I was too sensitive, that maybe I had misread it. It was never just you. Betty Anderson was 57, also black, a retired teacher from Memphis. She was carrying a folder, not a briefcase, a simple manila folder that looked like it had been opened and closed many times. She walked up to Margaret and opened it. Inside were printouts, emails, screenshots, handwritten notes with dates and times. The form letter from Delta, creased from being folded and unfolded. A timeline she had made herself on lined paper. I kept this because I knew. I didn't know when, but I knew. Margaret looked at the folder, at 2 years of documentation, at the specific faith it took to keep paper in a drawer for 2 years with no guarantee that it would ever matter. You waited a long time. I was waiting for the right time. Betty closed the folder. This is the right time. Angela had watched the 3 women meet. She had stood there quietly, holding her grandmother's hand, and when they were done talking, she looked up at Margaret. They're like you. What do you mean? They all stood up, even when it was hard. Sharon, who had been standing nearby, put her hand on Angela's shoulder. Yes, they did. Now, on the courthouse steps, the reporters were asking questions. Kenneth was answering them, and Margaret stood with Linda and Betty, and she thought about what came next, the depositions, the discovery, the meetings with attorneys, and the preparation, and the long, slow grinding machinery of a federal lawsuit. She was ready. 10 days later, Delta held another press conference. Richard White stood at a podium this time, the full executive team behind him. This was not a video recorded in an office. This was a formal response. 10 days ago, I said that what happened to Mrs. Margaret Harris was a moral failure. Today, I want to outline what we are doing to ensure it does not happen again. He listed the changes: an independent review board for discrimination complaints, third-party oversight, not internal, zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, first violation equals termination, no warnings, mandatory annual bias training for all flight attendants, public quarterly reporting of complaint statistics, a victim compensation fund, $2 million allocated for past victims to file claims, partnership with the NAACP for ongoing policy consultation. And then he said the thing that made Sharon sit up straighter. We have identified 7 passengers who filed complaints against Stephanie Clark between 2019 and 2024. We have reached out to all 7. 4 have responded. to Mrs. Margaret Harris, Dr. Linda Martinez, and Ms. Betty Anderson, who have already filed suit, and to the 4 other families we've identified, I want to say this directly. He looked into the camera. 7 passengers, 7 complaints, 5 years. Every single one of them told us something was wrong, and we didn't listen. He paused. That ends today. Margaret watched from Sharon's apartment. She did not cheer. She thought about the other 4 families, about whether they would come forward, about whether they felt ready. She thought about the words, our easy part, about seeing what Delta actually did in 6 months, in a year. This is real change, Sharon's voice. Margaret looked at her daughter. We'll see. Words are easy. Let's see what they do in 6 months. In a year. A pause. But yes, it's a start. 3 weeks after the incident, all parties met again. This time, the conversation was about settlement. Delta had returned with a new offer, all 3 families included. No non-disclosure agreements. Total settlement of $5.2 million to be split among the families, plus all legal fees covered. Public written apology to each family individually. Commitment to the policy changes already announced, with 6-month progress reports. Kenneth facilitated the conference call. This is a collective decision. If even one family says no, we continue to trial. I need to hear from each of you. Linda Martinez went first. Yes, this isn't just about money. It's about being heard. I feel heard now. For the first time in 3 years, I feel heard. Betty Anderson went second. Yes, I kept those papers for this day. This is what justice looks like when you refuse to let them forget. Margaret went last. She was quiet for a moment. I want to be clear about something. I didn't do this for money. I did this because my mother's necklace was ripped from my neck in front of my grandchildren. She paused. But more than that, I did this because 6 other people tried to speak and were silenced. And this settlement doesn't silence us. It amplifies us. Another pause. So yes, I vote yes. The settlement was finalized on a Wednesday afternoon in early October. Margaret was back in Atlanta by then. The necklace had been repaired. She had taken it to a jeweler in Harlem just as she'd planned. Mr. Pearson's son had done the work. The clasp was new, but matched the original perfectly. The chain showed no mark of what had happened to it. She put it on the morning the settlement was signed, and she wore it to the small gathering that Kenneth had organized. Just the 3 families, their attorneys, a representative from the NAACP. No press, no cameras, just the people who had done the work. Linda brought her daughter. Betty brought both of hers. Margaret had Angela and Christopher there. And at one point, the 3 women stood together, and Linda said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. We changed something, not just for us, for everyone who comes after. Margaret looked at her. That's what my mother would have wanted. 8 months after the incident, Margaret received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, return address in Atlanta, from Carol Lewis, the woman from row 22. Dear Mrs. Harris, you probably don't remember our phone call. I was the passenger in row 22 who didn't speak up. I wanted you to know something. Last month I was on a flight. I saw a flight attendant being rude to an elderly man. Nothing physical, just rude, dismissive, the kind of thing you might ignore because it's easier. I didn't ignore it. I spoke up. I said, "Excuse me, but I don't think that tone is necessary." It was a small thing, but I did it. I did it because 8 months ago you asked me a question. What would you want someone in row 22 to do? I finally have an answer. Thank you for teaching me. Carol Lewis. Margaret read it twice. She didn't cry, but her eyes were not entirely dry. She showed it to Sharon, who was visiting. Mom, you changed more than Delta. One person at a time. 9 months after the incident, Angela had a school assignment. Someone who inspires you. 500 words. Read it to the class. She wrote about her grandmother. Margaret didn't know about it until Angela asked her to come to school that Friday, parent visitation day. Some of the kids were reading their essays. Margaret sat in the back of the classroom and listened to her granddaughter, now 12, stand at the front and read. My grandmother is 72 years old. She's not famous. She's not rich. But she's the strongest person I know. Last year, I watched someone break her necklace on an airplane. It wasn't just any necklace. It was my great-grandmother's necklace. It was memory made into gold. I thought my grandmother would cry or yell, but she didn't do either. She stood up. She asked questions. She recorded everything, and she didn't back down. Later, she found out 6 other people had the same thing happen to them. They all tried to speak up. Nobody listened. My grandmother made them listen. She turned one broken necklace into 7 families getting justice. She turned one bad day into a company changing its rules. But the part that inspires me most isn't what she did to the airline. It's what she did with the necklace. She got it fixed, and she put it right back on. Because my grandmother taught me, when someone tries to take something from you, your dignity, your history, your family's memory, you don't let them keep it. You take it back, you fix it, and you wear it every single day. My great-grandmother Dorothy wore that necklace through segregation, through Jim Crow, through losing her husband. My grandmother Margaret wears it through everything that comes her way. One day, I'll wear it too, and I'll remember. Some things are worth standing up for even when you're scared, even when you're the only one, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The classroom was silent when she finished. Then the teacher, a Latina woman in her 40s named Ms. Rodriguez, started clapping. And then the other students joined in. Not the performative kind, the real kind, the kind that means something landed. Ms. Rodriguez had tears in her eyes. "Angela, that was beautiful. Your grandmother sounds remarkable." Angela looked back at Margaret, sitting in the back of the classroom. "She is, and she taught me I can be too." 1 year after the incident, Margaret's family gathered for Christmas at her house in Atlanta. Sharon flew down with Angela and Christopher. George came with his wife. Margaret's other 2 children came with their families. 12 people total around a table that had seen many Christmases, but none quite like this one. After dinner, Margaret stood at the head of the table. She touched the necklace at her throat. "I want to tell you all something." The table quieted. "1 year ago, someone tried to take this from me. They succeeded for about 5 minutes. She looked around the table, at her children, at her grandchildren, at George, who had been on the phone making calls before she'd even landed, at Sharon, who had turned a violation into a victory. But what they didn't understand is that you can't take memory away by breaking a chain. She touched her chest. "Memory lives here." Then she gestured to the table. "And here." Then she reached out and touched Angela's hand. "And here." Angela, now 12, looked at her grandmother with eyes that understood. "This necklace has been worn by 3 generations of women in this family. Dorothy wore it. I wear it. And one day," she looked at Angela, "when I'm gone and you're ready, it will be yours." Angela's eyes widened. "Not because you're the oldest girl, not because of tradition, but because you were there. You saw what it means to stand up. You learned the lesson." Angela stood, walked around the table, hugged her grandmother tight. "I'll take care of it, Grandma." Margaret held her. "I know you will, baby. I know you will." The room was quiet for a moment, the good kind of quiet, the kind that holds weight. Then Christopher, now 10, spoke up. "Can I wear it sometimes, too?" The table laughed. Real laughter, the kind that breaks tension and brings people back together. Margaret smiled at him. "We'll see, baby. We'll see." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Margaret sat alone in her kitchen. The house was quiet. The necklace was still around her neck. She touched it once. She thought about Dorothy, wearing it for 50 years. She thought about the morning it was torn from her throat. She thought about the jeweler's hands repairing it. She thought about putting it back on. She thought about Linda Martinez and Betty Anderson, about the 4 other families who had not come forward but who knew now that someone had stood up, about Carol Lewis learning to speak up in row 22, about Angela's essay, about the scholarship fund they had established for students pursuing civil rights law. She thought about Delta's quarterly reports. The first one had come out 6 months after the settlement. 47 discrimination complaints filed in 6 months, all investigated by the independent board. 12 had resulted in employee termination. 23 had resulted in retraining. 8 had been found to be unfounded but documented. 4 were still under investigation. Compare that to the previous 6 months. 52 complaints, 3 investigations, 0 terminations. The difference was accountability. She picked up her phone, scrolled to a message thread that had been active for the last year. It was the 3 of them, Margaret, Linda, Betty. They checked in every few weeks, shared articles, encouraged each other, made plans to meet up. Linda had sent a photo yesterday, her daughter wearing the stethoscope, graduating nursing school. Betty had sent one last week, her daughters at a school assembly, both wearing their earrings. Margaret took a photo of the necklace, close up, the gold catching the kitchen light. No explanation needed. She sent it to the thread. Linda responded first, a heart emoji. Then, still shining. Betty, still standing. Margaret, still here? She set the phone down, looked at the necklace one more time. Tomorrow she would wear it to church, and the day after that she would wear it to the grocery store, and the day after that she would wear it to Angela's soccer game. She would wear it because Dorothy had worn it, because it had survived what tried to break it, because 7 families had stood together and said enough, because some things are worth more than their weight in gold. Some things are worth standing up for, no matter the cost. And because Margaret Harris had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let someone else decide who you are or what you get to keep. She touched the necklace one last time. Then she stood, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. The necklace stayed on. It always would.